go out the data center, and this, otherwise very active, very loud warehouse is completely empty.
Oh,
And
gosh.
then off to my left, I see a strobe light flashing. And I'm like, this is where the zombies come, isn't it?
Welcome to War Stories, the cybersecurity podcast where we interview real penetration testers about real break-ins and epic hacks. Your host is Zach Davis, experienced physical and cybersecurity tester. In these short episodes, you'll experience the adrenaline rush and hear firsthand what it's like breaking into companies for a living. Enjoy the show.
And we are live with another episode of War Stories, the world's longest coffee commercial. Drink CyberCoffee. Nick, thanks for being here. I know you haven't tried the coffee yet. If you're a coffee drinker, we're definitely going to send you home with some of it. It's good stuff.
Thank you for having me. Yes.
Powers the hackers. We're trying to make power the hackers.
Definitely
Cool.
a coffee drinker. So
awesome.
Much
Well, we'll
appreciated.
make sure you get a bag or two to take home and give it a try. So today we have Nick Delewski, another hardware hacker. We've talked to one of your former coworkers, who also is one of my good friends, Matt Freilich, and I think that's a little bit of your story that I have heard before. But how did you get into this? Where'd you get started? Is there something that happened to you that kind of sent you down the hacker path? How'd you get here?
Sure. So the full road is a little bit winding, but sometimes you have some intersections that kind of cross over. So to start at the very beginning, I think my first exposure to information security was back in the bulletin board days. When used to go on bulletin boards and download cool things. Downloaded a screensaver one time called Meltdown. Turns out that I learned about viruses that day.
So actually, bulletin boards are slightly before my time. I don't think I ever interacted with one of those, but it's basically like you dial up internet, and then there would be these bulletin boards were kind of just like chat feeds, right, where people could post different types of stuff. And
so yeah, it's text-based. So if you think about something like an ncurses interface on a terminal program, you'd have letter-driven menus. You could go to message boards. You would have like a file upload, download, file sharing kind of area. And then, sometimes there would be games that you could play, like text-based strategy games and things of that nature.
So viruses like Meltdown.
Yeah, exactly.
Disguised as a screensaver.
Exactly. I to this day, I'm not 100% sure what it did. I think because I was like 11 at the time or whatever. If I had to venture a guess, I'd say that it like deleted my master boot record or something like that. So
it's really funny. Dave Catling, who I know you worked with as well, he told a story about, I don't think it was a virus, but he somehow deleted like System 32 on his parents' computer or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't think you can do that anymore. I think it'll stop you. Back in the day, it certainly could.
But yeah, I learned how to re-image a system after that. And then several years later, I go to college. Originally went to college for mechanical engineering. Wound up finding out that mechanical engineering wasn't for me while I was at college. But in order to sort of pay my way through college, daily expenses and stuff like that, I worked on the student help desk. And while working on the help desk, that's, if you remember, when there was this basically like turf war, pride war between these two hacking groups, Netsky and Bagel.
I don't know if I've heard this.
So what our job was on the student help desk, while these worms were absolutely tearing through the school's network, infecting everybody, they're trying to replicate. So they're overloading the hubs and switches and routers and bringing everything down. They had to completely shut off network access to everybody until we touched a system and, ran a virus scan and confirmed that it was clear. So every once in a while, we would get a system that had a live infection or a new infection, and we would get to kind of
interact with it a little bit.
Interact with it a little bit, see what ports it's opening, see how it behaved. and then kind of feed that information back to our network operations center, which is staffed with professionals, so they could come up with detections and, identify infected systems and shut down that port before the
Sure.
virus continued to
Before it
propagate.
propagates. So
So,
what time frame? I don't mean to date you, but
yeah, no worries, no worries.
This must have been like the early 2000s.
Yep.
Okay.
Early 2000s, 2002 to like 2005 or so was when I was doing this.
And what were the hacking groups? It was Bagel and
Netski.
Netsky. Okay, so they both had their different viruses that were just kind of running rampant.
They did, and I learned kind of after the fact, after I started getting into security a little bit more specifically, that sometimes there would be like code comments and strings within the viruses that were taunting the other group.
Sure.
And it's kind of interesting. I learned about one virus that I had encountered that had a message in it. And later on in my career, I actually met the person that this message was to.
Really?
So in this
Okay.
case, it was one friend sending a message to another friend as opposed to a rival.
Sure.
But really interesting world. I never got into it from that side, but it certainly catapulted my interest into security.
Yeah, and you started realizing like, oh, this is like cool stuff. There's real hackers out here. You're seeing the real world consequences of it, that type of thing.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Cool.
Absolutely.
So did you end up finishing with mechanical engineering, or did you pivot to IT at some point?
I did not. I got through about 3 years of mechanical engineering, and then I realized, hey, I've been doing this IT/help desk stuff for 3 years. I feel like I could do this for 40 hours plus a week. And
Sure.
so I got my first job working for a medical device manufacturer. They manufacture disposable medical devices, so not things with microchips in them.
Sure.
But I started off on the help desk there, and then quickly moved into desktop engineering. But after that, I moved into systems administration, getting into Windows AD a little bit deeper. We had a couple of different domains that we managed by the time I left, and getting to know domain trusts and how all of that works on the back end wound
That's
up
right in
being-
line with the pen testing stuff. If you
Yeah,
start learning how to ride different domains and do different things like that.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And then I took a short detour to do blue team security for
Oh, okay.
the financial services industry.
Sure, that was a lot of valuable skill sets you're picking up there, though. I always think like
Yeah.
guys who've sat on the blue team for a while. One of our guys on our team, Tally, he went and wrote rules for a former employer for quite a few years, and I think he just knows so much more on the detection side than the rest of us who were always on the red side. I think that can be really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that was also where I got into the product security side of things as well, because that was right around the time when infrastructure as a service started to become a thing, and so did software as a service. So, used to be, you're a software company, you write desktop software, you sell that, you sell a certain number of licenses, and you send that out to your customers. But then there was this other business model of, oh, well, what if we just run the software and host it and give you an instance of that?
The
And so-
licensing, multi-tenant world was kind of being born.
Exactly. And so, I simultaneously got exposure to the blue team side of network security and enterprise security, while also getting to interact with our developers. And I was actually the go-between between third-party penetration testers and those developers.
Okay.
That's actually where I met one of your previous guests, John Beck.
I was gonna ask, well, because I knew you, Matt Wilson, one of our guys, he hooked us up, but then I remembered you had worked with Freilich, and then I was talking to him this morning, and he said, yeah, you guys all crossed paths at Core, right?
Core BTS.
Yeah. Okay.
So I worked with John when he was at Core BTS, and then John left Core, and I basically stepped into his role there.
Okay. Interesting. All right.
after I left the financial services field, and that's kind of where my red team journey started.
Okay.
And then while at Core, I got a lot of exposure to full scope red teaming, physical pen testing, social engineering, all the rest of that. We did some web app stuff and some network stuff there too. But
Okay.
I was
So you have had the whole background of like all penetration testing. You haven't always been a medical device specific guy.
correct. Yeah. Then, after that, I went to another place, Spirent Communications. That's where I got a little bit more into the um, product security testing there. We also did some really, really cool physical and internal engagements while I was there as well.
Okay.
But
Those are a favorite of the podcast. They love the physical stories.
yeah,
Wilson didn't tell me what your story was, but he said he thought you had a pretty good one. So
it's a
stay
good
tuned
one.
for that.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. But yeah, after that, I kind of got the medical device bug. And hearkening back to my days at the disposable medical device manufacturer, like, you have to understand, back in the day, FDA would say that an unplanned software change represented a greater risk to product quality than a virus would.
So they were less worried about the vulnerabilities and more worried about just like keeping the firmware like stable.
Correct. Yeah. And
Got it.
in the context of something like a disposable medical device manufacturer, the thought being that, hey, this PC that's running your production line is, very carefully calibrated to make sure that, this device is exactly this thickness within these tolerances. And so if you are unknowingly injecting delays in these software checks that are polling sensors and stuff like that, then that could induce quality issues that could have patient care implications.
Reminds me a little bit of like just working with OT networks. We've gotten into more and more of that, and it's like you see stuff. Like when I first started getting into OT, you see stuff on these networks that you're just like, it boggles your mind. Like these huge machines that are still running Windows XP. But then when you dig into it, you're like, well, this is an air gap network. They don't do updates kind of for that exact reason. They don't know what small change could mean a millisecond delay and cause some sort of, unforeseen consequence. It's much more complicated than an enterprise network where, if somebody doesn't get their email, like no one's going to die.
Yeah, exactly. And that's precisely what it is. It's different flavors of OT network.
Yeah.
And so fast forward like 9 or so years, and FDA is really starting to change its tune about what the threat landscape looks like. And in 2014, they start coming out with actual guidances about cybersecurity and medical devices. More medical devices are starting to contain meaningful logic and firmware that can make changes to the therapies that people are receiving. And so they're looking to what the future state is going to be of the threat landscape.
Sure. Well, I'm guessing it's changing too, just because we see it all that like there's so many. Everybody wants to be in the cloud now, and it's even like I do work with a bunch of OT networks, and there are these vendors that, they just the default for them is you're gonna have a subscription for this service that communicates with the cloud, and when you try and tell them this is an air gap network, like there's no internet connection, like it's this big like complicated workaround. But I would imagine medical devices, are probably somewhat in the same boat in some cases. Like, do you see a lot of cloud integration where like, there's an app that's sending data up to some sort of SaaS-based application, or are you working on stuff that's still more localized, I guess?
You see everything. You see everything. Yeah. Then in medical devices, there's a lot of value in analytics, right? So not only are you studying patient treatments and outcomes and things like that, you're also studying sort of workflow and optimization. Because with the pandemic, I think that we really started as a country to understand the burdens that are on healthcare providers these days.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of turnover in that field. And so, you have your more experienced clinicians, your more experienced nurses leaving early, and then being replaced by some less experienced nurses and clinicians who are maybe a little bit more familiar with technology going forward, but they're less familiar with the medicine.
The
So
underlying medicine.
exactly. And so there is an opportunity there to kind of regain some of that productivity and make sure that hospitals are able to serve their local populations appropriately by connecting things and extracting stories from the data.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of not only sort of localized interaction within the hospital network, but also maybe some data analytics that's kind of fueling the need for some of this connectivity going forward. But with that connectivity, as I'm sure you're aware, comes some level of exposure.
Yeah.
So it's definitely an interesting world. And then
Evolving.
the FDA specifically has kind of stepwise started preparing the industry for some real regulations around it. And then fast forward to about 2022, when there actually was some specific legislation passed, rather, through Congress. It turns out that no matter what your political party, nobody wants to be connected to a hacked medical device.
Yeah.
So they actually gave FDA statutory authority to start enforcing some cybersecurity regulations. And then those regulations started really taking effect last year. So things like mandating penetration tests before the FDA will say that a connected medical device is going to be safe, mandating things like threat modeling to make sure that you actually took a structured look at your device and all of the things that it connects to make sure you understand the security implications of how you designed and architected that system.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how the federal government is starting. Like I'm seeing like different little pockets of regulation that are kind of coming up. It's like for a while I was doing stuff with CMMC, which is like the whole Department of Defense, supply chain, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We do some work with clients that are dealing with like the TSA, like Security Directive 2, for pipeline operations coming out of the colonial stuff. Like they're getting a bunch of cybersecurity regulation, medical devices. It's like, think the whole world is kind of getting more interconnected, and now everybody's starting to realize like how important cybersecurity is, and how it's just changing all the time.
Yeah, and I think that we're starting to really lay down some rules of the road that can cross over, sometimes between those silos, right? Because whenever you have regulations that aren't unified, you have one body that's saying you need to do it this way, you have another body saying you need to do it this way. What if you have a product that kind of crosses both industry verticals, so to speak?
Sure.
Which way do you design it? Do you have two different configurations, or do you try to fit both regulatory schemes into the same design, which maybe is a little bit difficult, but might wind up being less expensive. So ultimately, everything comes down to how do you meet the letter and the spirit of the regulations while also making a product that can turn a profit.
Sure. Yeah, I do think there's some overlap between a lot of the other regulations. Like you see stuff that's just like, it's kind of the same set of controls, but they're packaged up in a slightly different way. So there's like some overlap between a lot of these different frameworks, but and I'm more dealing with like network data stuff, PCI, like in CMMC, some HIPAA. The product side, I guess, is probably a whole nother can of worms, but there are a lot of, I think, underlying cybersecurity trends that kind of cross all these things. Then there's some specifics to certain industries and I guess probably device types and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's I guess a lot of existing ISO standards and whatnot that apply to, like, for example, software quality checking, that you can then bring over to the cybersecurity world. Philosophically, security vulnerabilities are a form of bug, right? Some bugs you're going to squash, some bugs, for various reasons don't really meet that threshold, or the risk isn't there, or
it's a feature.
or it's a feature. Hopefully we're not
bug or a feature. The
hopefully
question we always ask Microsoft.
we're not overusing that that question too much in what we do, but you never know. Every
Yeah.
once in a while, it does come up.
Yeah. Cool. So medical device specific. Do you have a medical device specific tool that's your favorite these days, or something you use a lot that you'd want to tell us about?
So I wouldn't say it's medical device specific, but it's been very, very useful in medical devices. And what I'll say is it's actually a stack of tools.
Okay.
Because when you're doing things with hardware and when you're doing things with the physical layer, oftentimes you do need to account for kind of what your activities do to the environment around you. So what I'll say is that a stack of tools that I rely on is Blade RF, which is a software-defined radio.
Blade RF. Okay.
Dragon OS, which is a really awesome operating system that contains a lot of software-defined radio-specific tools, pre-compiled with different library versions and things like that you
We
need
talking
in
like
order to.
a Kali Linux kind of thing, sort of more
Yeah.
specific to, SDR, right?
Yeah,
Is that the term,
more.
SDR?
Yep, more focused
software
on
defined radio.
SDR and wireless, and definitely major credit to the contributors to Dragon OS who put that together and make all of the different pieces work together with all the different SDRs that are out there. There's a lot of really specific driver tweaking that you need to do if you're building things from scratch in the SDR world. And then I'll add on to that stack a microwave oven.
A microwave oven.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So
Is that for Faraday properties?
exactly,
Okay.
exactly. So if you think about what a microwave is, right?
Yeah.
It's a box designed to keep harmful radio waves from getting outside of the box. And so you can actually, with a fairly inexpensive microwave oven, build yourself a serviceable Faraday cage for most applications.
Okay.
I will asterisk this by saying always obey the laws and regulations before you transmit anything. Always test your Faraday cage for your particular test that you're running beforehand. Nobody wants to run afoul of any of those regulations out there.
Okay. So I got to bring it up a little bit for our non-technical audience. And I've actually got a story about a Faraday cage too, which you might have heard. But so a Faraday cage, and you can probably explain it much more elegantly than I, but it basically is like an enclosure where you can place a device that's communicating over some sort of wireless medium, or I guess maybe just electronical interference could come into play as well. But it's going to, our modern world, there's Wi-Fi everywhere. There's just so much interference. And if you're trying to test something really specific, you put a device into a Faraday cage, all the extraneous Bluetooth, wireless, all those different things are going to be ideally filtered out so you can focus specifically on the test case you're working on.
Correct. Yeah, correct. And
So did you ever see the Faraday cage we had at the Protivity office that Matt Freilich built?
I saw pictures of it.
Okay. Yeah, when we were there and he was just getting into this type of testing, he built this huge cage in the office because we were on the 21st floor at Liberty One in downtown Philadelphia. Like it was just, it could not have been more interference. And he built this whole, it's like made out of PVC pipe. I think there was chicken wire and then like screen on the outside of it. I don't know how effective it was, but I think it worked well enough for whatever he was trying to do. So I never knew a microwave could also be an effective Faraday cage.
Yeah, yeah. You just have to maybe disconnect some electronics on the inside and mind some big scary capacitors to make sure you don't hurt yourself.
Make sure you
I'm not
ground them.
not endorsing this. Do your own research. But yeah, if you add some SMA connectors, so like the coax connectors that go through the metal, maintain a good ground, most of your signal winds up staying inside.
Okay.
And so that's also pretty important just from the perspective of the fact that if you're working with medical devices, especially medical devices that are wearable or medical devices that might be inside somebody, you never know who's going to walk by the office, especially if you're in a shared environment. So, I don't want somebody walking down the sidewalk next to my lab, feeling the effects of whatever I'm doing with whatever
Sure.
device I'm working on. So shoving that all in a workable Faraday cage, I think, is just better for safety in general.
Yeah, I never even thought about that part of it. If you're launching attacks against like a Bluetooth protocol or something, and there happened to be someone with a pacemaker in like the next office, I mean, in
Mhm.
theory, you could cause some damage.
Yeah, like even if you're just spraying dev random at a device, depending on the underlying protocol and whether or not it's capable of filtering out garbage and extraneous data, could have an effect. You never know. Better
Sure.
safe than sorry.
Okay, cool. So what was it one more time? It was Dragon OS, a
Bl-
microwave, and
Microwave and Blade RF.
Blade RF. All right, for the aspiring hardware hackers, you can go check those out, and we'll put them in the show notes. So with all that being said, sounds like you've got medical device background, you've got some
Mhm.
regular pen testing background, and Wilson said you had a great story. So what do you got for us today?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned before, I've got a good deal of experience with just general red team pen testing. And while the physical pen tests were often the most fun, and they're the ones that you see in movies, you'd think that they would be the most dangerous. The most danger I was ever in was actually not on a physical pen test. It was on a
Okay.
normal internal.
Okay.
Um, I was in a warehouse, is a very active warehouse outside of a metropolitan area. And basically, this was an unannounced test. So they didn't want people to see that I was there and then behave any differently than
Sure,
they
they're gonna
otherwise would have
stick you in
been.
the basement conference room or in a closet or something. I think we've all done a few
Yeah,
of those.
exactly. It wound up being the data center
Okay.
because it was mostly a lights out data center. There was a little room off to the side that I could kind of do my thing. And, I wouldn't be raising any red flags among the IT ops folks, but there really wasn't a need for me to do social engineering or find my way in or anything like that there. So, I'm sitting there doing my work, and you all know when you've been doing this for a while that a lot of what penetration testing is banging your head against the wall, right? You're
Sure.
you're trying to find stuff that is potentially vulnerable to um, various types of attack, but most of the time you're trying to get things to do things that it's not supposed to do. You're trying to use
Yeah.
something in a way that it's not designed, and you're going to fail because engineers do a good job, and they do error checking and all the rest of it.
That's what I always tell people. It's like I occasionally have a client that's like, we want a list of everything you're doing throughout this whole penetration test. And I'm like,
Right.
no, you don't. You want a list of the stuff that's successful, and I will give you that, but I'm not going to timestamp every command I'm running, everything I'm trying, because a lot of it's not going to work and it's a big waste of time. Like,
Right.
yeah. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And so when you do find that one string that you can start to pull, that's something that you can really latch on to, right? And so that's what happened here. I had found this one string. I had, some embedded device, low power that, was basically held together by bubble gum and duct tape. I forget exactly what it was. Maybe it was a security camera or something like that.
Mhm.
But I had thought that I could find some command injection in it. And so I keep on pulling that thread and pulling that thread. Eventually, I don't wind up getting command injection, but I do wind up getting creds,
Okay.
or at least hashes for creds. So then I go to my next step, which is, all right, well, I've got these hashes. Now I need to get the actual creds. So I go ahead and fire up. I believe at the time the state of the art was the original Hashcat. So
Okay.
I fire up Hashcat. I do my thing to try to tune my word list and kind of get the creds.
Were you running it on a local laptop?
Yeah.
That used to work. It's weird to think about now because we have this crazy password cracker. But the first couple years, we would just run Hashcat on our MacBook, and we would recover passwords all the time. Like, I think we did have a cracker back in the office, but you didn't always need it back then.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But I had a decently powered laptop, and so it did its thing, and while it was trying to get these hashes, I was going back through all the rest of my notes and all the rest of my network scans and make sure that I, was prioritizing all of the other hosts that I found on the network and making sure that there's no other big red flags out there. So I eventually wind up getting these creds, which gives me access to some basic network resources, SMB shares and stuff like that. So I start going through those SMB shares, seeing what I have access to now, seeing if I can find any sensitive data. My goal here was cardholder data for PCI
Okay.
transactions.
PCI pen test.
Yeah, and so all of this time, I'm kind of laser focused on this because especially when you're on site, you have a bit more of a hard deadline you have to
Yeah,
work.
you're trying to get it done.
Yeah,
You're, like,
you got to get
ignoring
it
everything
done.
else.
Yeah, because if you have to, reschedule extra time on site, sometimes that doesn't work with the
It's gonna
client.
screw up
Sometimes
your
that doesn't
next
work.
week.
And
You got another test coming.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I keep pulling this thread. I keep getting more and more access within the environment. Finally, I find an admin script laying out there that has some domain admin creds embedded into it.
Nice.
I'm like, yes, awesome. I know I've got it, even though I don't have access to the cardholder environment right now. I know that I can get it. I'm not going to take that extra step and like actually see the data because I kind of have the creds and I can
Yeah,
say.
you got the proof of concept.
So I am elated. I'm like, you always have that rush, right? When you achieve your goal. And so I go out the data center and this, otherwise very active, very loud warehouse is completely empty.
Oh, gosh.
And then off to my left, I see a strobe light flashing. And I'm like, this is where the zombies come, isn't it? And so I start walking down the hallway toward that flashing strobe light. And I start seeing more flashing lights from
nobody's
a window.
around.
Nobody is around. And those flashing lights are all red and some red and blue. And I'm like, oh no. So I hightail it out of there, find out what is going on.
Leave all your stuff.
Leave all my stuff. Turns out, for the better part of about 3 hours, I was in a data center in a warehouse that was filling with natural gas because a forklift operator sheared off the main.
Holy
and the
shit.
fire
Oh my
department
gosh.
couldn't find the shutoff at the street.
So you were like literally just sitting in a box in a potential
Sitting in a box, as the very large space around me filled with a potentially flammable amount of natural gas.
Holy cow.
And my contact just simply forgot I was there because I didn't sign in on the ledger. Nobody was supposed to know that I was there, even though I wasn't sneaking
It's
around.
like a perfect storm. Like,
yeah,
they're trying to
exactly.
sneak the pen tester in the back door and then they forget about him
When something
there's a gas
actually
leak.
important happens. And so I lost situational awareness because I got tunnel vision pulling the thread.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, nobody's looking for me. I don't need to try to be sneaky, so I can just get this done and get on with the rest of my day. But I tell this story to all the junior pen testers that I talk to because that situational awareness is important no matter what you're doing when you're on a pen
100%.
test.
I'm surprised they didn't have flashing lights in the data center, but I guess it's probably
Nope.
on some separate HVAC system and it's like, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah,
Wow.
no enunciators at all within the data center. I think they just figured, since, hey, if any fire gets there, the FM200's just going to do its thing while it can.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll protect the data center, maybe it won't. But
So when you came walking out the front door, was the fire department like, "What the hell are you doing?" Like,
Oh yeah, they're looking at me. They're like, "Who the hell is this guy?" And I see some firefighters like almost violently gesture, "Come over this way, come over this way." And I find out what's going on. I'm like, "Oh
that's
yeah,
wild.
that's definitely the most danger I've been in as a pen tester." And this is after having done physicals at some facilities that are actually like protected by sworn law enforcement and stuff like that as well.
I don't think I've ever heard. That's probably one of the scariest ones I've ever heard. I would think like that legitimately
so.
could have been so bad. Like,
Yeah,
that's crazy. Cool. Well, that's definitely one of the more unique stories I think we've had on War Stories.
Good.
Cool.
Good. Hopefully somebody at home will take that to heart and make sure you've got a spotter whenever you're anywhere undercover, I guess I'll call it.
Yeah, make sure somebody knows. And your point of contact, I feel like that he really dropped the ball there. Like
I feel like he did too.
Yeah, that could have been bad.
It's all water under the bridge at this point.
Cool. Well, that was a good one. Really appreciate you being here, Nick. How do people find you if they want to test a medical device? Do you want to plug yourself, plug your spot?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. My name is Nick Delewski. I'm a principal security consultant at MedSec. You can reach out to me at Nick Delewski, no period, because we don't roll that way. Nick Delewski at medsec.com.
Nick Delewski at medsec.com. Cool. Well, thanks a lot for being here. That was a great story. And for all you guys out there, don't forget to get your CyberCoffee. And Nick, you're going to have to give it a try and tell everybody how great it is.
Awesome. Will do.
Sounds good. Thanks a
all
lot,
right.
Nick.
Thank you, Zach.
Yeah.
Take care.
Weird ending.
The handshake. Half splash fist bump. I've never done that before, have I?